Welcome, AP Economics students. This is Miss Foley, and this is a review of Unit 4, the financial sector. If you talk to anyone in macroeconomics, I think many of you would agree, Unit 4 was definitely one of the most challenging. There's a lot of information, there's a couple of different graphs, and it's just a lot to take in. So I really wanted to make sure that when we review the financial sector, that I did a good job going through all those little details and ways that kids screw up so that you can be armed for test day to do a really wonderful job. Okay? So if you remember, Unit 3 takes a look at the macroeconomic equilibrium graph for the first time. So if you look over here to the top right, we know that there's macroeconomic equilibrium. That's what we all aspire to be. We know that there is a possibility for a recessionary gap. That is when your output and price level is to the left of LRAS. We know that there's a possibility of an inflationary gap, and that is when your equilibrium is to the right of the LRAS. And a lot of times, the government doesn't like recessions, doesn't like high inflation periods. So the government may do something to try to fix that, to get us towards macroeconomic equilibrium. We know that we can't, as the government or any entity, control the short run aggregate supply curve, but we can do things to shift the aggregate demand curve. One of the ways that we can shift the aggregate demand curve, if you remember from Unit 3, was with fiscal policy. And that is when Congress members, maybe the president, will recommend policies such as increase or decrease government spending, increase, decrease taxes, increase, decrease government transfers. Any of those three things would be considered fiscal policy. And that's what we learned in Unit 3. That's one way to go about things. Another way to go about things is in Unit 4 something called monetary policy. Okay? Monetary policy is we're talking about the Federal Reserve. Depending on the country, sometimes they have different names for it. They might call it the central bank, they might call it the national bank. Different places might have a different name for it. In the United States, we call it the Federal Reserve, the nickname the Fed. And there are some things that the Federal Reserve can do to shift that aggregate demand curve to, if you are in a recessionary gap, maybe you want to shift it to the right to get to macroeconomic equilibrium. If you're in an inflationary gap, maybe you want to shift it to the left to get into equilibrium. So here are the types of monetary policy that you need to know, and you absolutely need to know for test day. The first one is a reserve requirement. Ever since the Great Depression happened, there has been regulations on banks that when you deposit, when an individual deposits money into a bank, maybe from a paycheck or birthday money from your grandma or whatever, when you put money in the bank is required to hold a percentage of that in their vault. They'll take the rest of the money and they'll lend it out because that's what banks like to do. They want to lend out money because that's how they make money, but they are required to hold a percentage. If the Federal Reserve decides to increase that percentage, that means that banks are holding on to more money, which means they are lending less money, which means that with less money out there, less money available, less consumption spending, less investment spending, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So if we increase the reserve requirement, that's how we can decrease aggregate demand. If we decrease the reserve requirement, instead of saying, hey, you need to hold on to 20% of the banks need to hold on to 20% of the money, they only need to hold on to 10. Well, that's going to mean that there will be more money available for loans, that people will maybe go to a more expensive college, maybe buy a more expensive home, maybe investors will invest in a new factory or a new clothing line. and that will shift aggregate demand curve to the right. So changing the reserve requirement is something the Fed can do. It's one type of monetary policy, and that could shift, help us get out of a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap. Full disclosure, the Federal Reserve doesn't use the change in reserve requirement all that much. It's just something that's not used as much. So just know that, like, in the back of your mind. Then there's this situation of something called a discount rate. You know, and I know that at the end of the day, every bank needs to have their reserve requirement. Sometimes things can get a little crazy. Maybe banks lent out too much money, or maybe uncharacteristically, a bunch of people went to take money out of the bank for some reason. That could be another reason too. So sometimes when the bank closes and you go, uh-oh, I don't have enough money in my vault to meet my reserve requirement. So let's say you're PNC or you're Bank of America and you say, uh-oh, we don't have enough money in our vaults to meet the reserve requirement. What you need to do is get a loan to make up the difference and meet your reserve requirement. Now, there are two places that you can get loans. The first place, the preferred place, is for banks to go to other banks and ask them for a loan. So let's say PNC Bank goes, oh my goodness, we're below our reserve requirement. I'm going to go call Bank of America and ask them to give me a loan. The terms of that loan are defined by the Federal Reserve, and those terms are known as the federal funds rate. So that federal funds rate is what the Fed says banks can charge other banks to do that. And that federal funds rate is always below the discount rate. The discount rate is, let's say you call a bunch of the banks and nobody can help you, nobody has any extra money to lend to you. Then what you're going to do is you're going to call the Federal Reserve and say, hey, Federal Reserve, we didn't have a lot, we are below our reserve requirement. Can we take out a loan from you? The Federal Reserve will say, sure, you can take a loan out and you'll pay us back using the discount rate as your interest rate. Now, so again, Federal Reserve, federal funds rate is below the discount rate. It's kind of like the teacher asks you to ask other students for help before going to the teacher. It's the same kind of idea, same kind of perspective. But in terms of monetary policy, the Federal Reserve can increase the discount rate if they want to signal to banks that they don't want to lend money out as much. So for example, if I'm in an inflationary gap, like on the top right hand part of your page, and the Federal Reserve says, well, we want to kind of fix this inflationary gap, one thing that we might do is we might tell banks, we're raising the discount rate, which means you should be extra careful to be sure that you don't lend out too much money and need to call us, because if you do, we just raise the discount rate and it's going to cost you. So whenever the Federal Reserve raises that discount rate, it's kind of like a warning sign, and you see banks being a lot more careful. They're not lending out as much money. And since they're not lending out as much money, consumption spending goes down, investment spending goes down, and you guessed it, aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So that's how, if we increase the discount rate, that's how we can get the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left. Conversely, if let's say we're in a recession, which is kind of sort of what's happening now during the COVID-19 pandemic, if you're going through a little bit of a recession, the Federal Reserve might say to banks, hey, lend out money. Lend out money as much as you can, because we want consumption spending to go up. We want investment spending to go up. And, if you go a little overboard and you need to borrow money from us using the discount rate, we lowered that rate, so it's not really going to cost you that much. So that might be another type of monetary policy that you see. So the first one is changing the reserve requirement. The second one is changing the discount rate. The third type of monetary policy is open market operations. Um, it is the most popular type of monetary policy. If they ask you a free response question, which they've asked in the past, what type of monetary policy is most popular, is used most often, is the go-to, you're going to say open market operations. It's get its own cute name. And open market operations just means the bank buying and selling bonds. For those of you who don't know, a bond is a piece of paper that after a certain amount of period of time is worth an amount. So for example, when I was younger, my grandma bought me a $100 savings bond. So she gave me the piece of paper when I was younger, and it literally was kind of like a piece of paper. My grandma paid $50 for a $100 savings bond. That was because she gave it to me and said, in 10 years, this will be worth $100. It's kind of like an IOU that you give to the United States government. Hey, United States government, I'm going to give you $50 today, and then in 10 years, you're going to give me $100. That's the most popular type of bond, like a U.S. savings bond. On the test, or depending on the textbook that you're using, you might hear them say treasury bills, treasury bonds, savings bonds, U.S. Treasury exchange. Any of those things, they all mean the same thing. Okay, they're these pieces of paper that hold value. You can't use them right away. So when I was 15 years old and needed to buy a Razor scooter, because that was what was really cool back then, I couldn't use my savings bond because it hadn't matured yet. So, but it's pieces of paper, and banks a lot of times have these pieces of paper on hand to hold value. And essentially, what happens is the federal government, the Federal Reserve in particular, can buy and sell these if they want to increase or decrease the aggregate demand curve. So, let me explain. Let's say, for example, that you are in a recessionary gap. Okay, if the Federal Reserve says, I don't like this, I want to correct this using open market operations. One way that they would do that is by buying bonds. So the Federal Reserve goes to PNC, goes to Bank of America, goes to Wells Fargo, and says, hey, banks, give us those pieces of paper that you really can't use but do hold value. Give us these pieces of paper, and in exchange, we'll give you liquid cash. Well, what can these banks, PNC, Wells Fargo, Bank of America do right away? They can lend it out. So they lend out that money, lend, and consumption spending goes up, and investment spending goes up because our interest rates are lower. Okay, so that's going to increase that type of spending. All right, so that's that. On the other side, let's say that the Federal Reserve says, oh my goodness, we're in an inflationary gap. This is bad news. What do we do? The Federal Reserve will say, we're selling bonds. We're going to go to individual banks, take their liquid currency so they can't loan out the money anymore, give them pieces of paper. The money supply decreases, a vertical line here. And what that is going to do is interest rates are higher, which means consumption spending goes down, which means investment spending goes down, and that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So those are the three types of monetary policy. Everything that these do impact the money supply, which is this money market graph. It's always nominal interest rate, quantity of money, and when the reserve requirement goes up, What does that do? That decreases the money supply. So that decreases the money supply because there's less money for banks to lend out, which means interest rates go up, which means that loans for consumption spending and investment spending goes down, and aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. Conversely, reserve requirement goes down. That means that there's more money available, money supply increases, a new vertical line like this, and that means that consumption spending is cheaper, investment spending is cheaper, and that's going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that's your money market graph. Those are your three different types. These change the money supply, which change here, which shift that. Okay. Couple of things that you need to know. Loanable funds graph. This is from the perspective of real interest rate. So the supply and the demand of loanable funds can shift, changes in expectations, changes in prices, those sorts of things. So just know that the loanable funds graph exists, and you may be using it a little bit in Unit 4. And I'm going to spend a lot more time in Unit 5 really going over that. But loanable funds graph is really real interest rate. Money market graph is nominal interest rate. In terms of some other things on the page, if you take a look, this is a bank balance sheet. What you need to know is that there's always two columns, assets and liabilities. What they like to do on the AP exam is they like to put a bunch of categories that you don't need to know or it doesn't matter to you, and therefore it's there to really confuse you. The things that you need to worry about are, what are the loans, what are the reserves in terms of assets, and what are the liabilities, and those are demand deposits. So that's money that people put in the bank, and you're responsible for as the bank, that when people come back to get their birthday money, to get their work check, that it's shown in liabilities. And we're going to do a sample problem to take a look at that in just a few moments. Two other really big things that I kind of put here by themselves and highlighted because it's just key information that you need to know is what a money multiplier is. A money multiplier is when a bank lends out money, that money multiplies the same way that money multiplies in government spending, the same way that money multiplies in taxes when you change taxes or when you change government transfers. When you're dealing with the money multiplier, when you're talking about monetary policy, is quite simply 1 over the reserve requirement. So if the reserve requirement is 10%, it's 1 over 0.1, and that gives you a money multiplier of 10. The second aspect that you need to be aware of here is that price of bonds and interest rates have an inverse relationship. When interest rates are really low, bonds are more appealing because they're steady and they are a constant, pretty much interest rate. My grandma gave me a $100 savings bond in, let's say, the year 1990. In the year 2000, it was worth $100. So her money doubled in 10 years. So that's a kind of a constant interest rate. That's very appealing to buy bonds when interest rates are low. You'll probably see people nowadays who have some extra money lying around because interest rates are so low, they're going to go and buy some bonds, and it wouldn't be a bad idea. When interest rates are high, bonds are less appealing because you can put your money in a bank and receive a high interest rate, and that seems like, that's where you're going to make more money than a constant, steady interest rate with bonds. So that's why they have an inverse relationship, and that's an important aspect that you need to know. Okay, first page of the financial sector. Here is the second page. Now, if I were you, I would print this out, especially if you are doing this during COVID-19 and you get to have, materials available that you could reference. This is pretty much everything you need to know in a nutshell when it comes to Unit 4. Okay? Um, so, when I do expansionary monetary policy, because I'm in a recessionary gap, I want to increase the money supply. That leads to a lower interest rate. That leads to a higher investment spending. That leads to higher consumer spending. A lot of times people put these two things next to each other together. They're kind of the same. And then that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. So that is, buying bonds, that is decreasing the discount rate, that is decreasing the reserve requirement. That's expansionary monetary policy. Contractionary monetary policy, when you want to shift the aggregate demand curve down, is when you want to decrease the money supply. So that is increasing reserve requirement. That's one way to do it. Increasing discount rate. That's another way to do it. Selling bonds, open market operation. That's the third way to do it. When you decrease the money supply, interest rates go up. Investment projects, investment spending goes down. Consumer spending also goes down, and that shifts aggregate demand curve to the left. So, this is kind of an overview of everything that I just said. Really important. I would print this out if I were you. I know that this is a video, but I also included those Google Slides in Google Classroom.